Margaret Turner, a 58-year-old widow, lived in Charleston, South Carolina, in the modest house she had maintained for decades. That little home wasn't just bricks and wood. It carried the laughter of her late husband, the first steps of her children, and countless family dinners. Yet despite her sacrifices, Margaret often felt invisible in her own family. At a recent Sunday family gathering, she sat quietly at the corner of her own dining table. Her son, Daniel Turner, now 35 and ambitious, dominated conversations about his latest business ventures. Her daughter-in-law, Jessica, chimed in often, while relatives laughed at every word Daniel said. Margaret, however, was hardly acknowledged, except when someone asked her to pass the bread. She sipped her tea silently, her mind replaying the years of sacrifices she had made, working double shifts, skipping her own dreams just to give her children opportunities. The subtle sting of disrespect wasn't new, but that evening something in her shifted. Beneath her calm exterior, a spark flickered, a quiet determination she hadn't felt in years. Would you, in her place, keep enduring quietly? Or would you finally decide to stand up for yourself? The following weekend, Margaret found herself at a family brunch in downtown Charleston. It was supposed to be a light-hearted gathering, but for her, it quickly turned into another reminder of where she stood in her family. The brunch was hosted at her elder brother's home, Richard Miller, now 62, a man who had always been loud and domineering. Margaret's 82-year-old mother, Evelyn, was also present, perched at the head of the table, watching everything with sharp, judgmental eyes. As the meal unfolded, Evelyn began her usual routine. "Margaret, why is it that you never season the eggs properly when you cook? I remember last time it was bland." Her voice cut through the cheerful chatter like a knife. Margaret forced a smile, swallowing the sting. "Mom, these eggs aren't even mine. Jessica made them." But before she could say more, Richard chuckled loudly, slapping his knee. "Doesn't matter, Maggie. You've never been much of a cook anyway." His neighbors, who were invited to the brunch, laughed politely, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to confront Richard's mockery. Margaret's face burned. She lowered her eyes to her plate, feeling like she had shrunk several inches. She caught sight of her younger sister, Linda, sitting quietly at the far end. Linda's eyes softened with sympathy, but she said nothing. Later, as dishes were being cleared, Linda leaned close and whispered, "Don't let them get to you, Maggie. They'll never see how much you've done unless you show them." Her words planted a seed, though Margaret only nodded. Later that afternoon, Margaret walked alone through the cobblestone streets of Charleston. She watched couples her age strolling hand in hand, retirees chatting at cafes, and shop owners running businesses they had built with pride. Every face she saw seemed to shine with independence, self-respect, and recognition, things she had never truly claimed for herself. Her mind wandered back to Richard's booming laugh, Evelyn's constant nitpicking, and Daniel's smug way of talking about his future plans while ignoring the sacrifices she had made for him. Margaret stopped at the corner near a bookstore and caught her reflection in a shop window. For the first time, she admitted to herself how deeply those small humiliations had cut her. Inside her chest, frustration coiled into something sharper. "I've spent my life making everyone else comfortable," she thought. "Maybe it's time they see what I'm capable of." That quiet decision didn't look like much from the outside, but it was the turning point. Margaret wasn't going to lash out recklessly. She was going to plan. She was going to be strategic. And here's the question. If you were constantly belittled by your own family in front of others, would you keep your silence? Or start plotting your rise? The morning after the brunch, Margaret decided she needed clarity away from the noise of family voices. She slipped into a cozy little cafe in downtown Charleston, a place she had visited for years but rarely lingered in. The scent of fresh coffee and baked pastries wrapped around her like comfort. At the corner table by the window, her old friend Caroline Hayes, 59, was already waiting. Caroline had been Margaret's confidant since their high school days, the one person who never judged her. As Margaret settled in with her cup of black coffee, Caroline leaned forward. "You've got that look again, Maggie. Something's brewing in that head of yours." Margaret let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. Richard mocked me in front of half the neighborhood yesterday. Mom barely lifted a finger. And Daniel, he just sat there letting it happen. I felt invisible. Caroline frowned. You've been invisible to them for years. Maybe it's time you stop letting them treat you that way. Margaret stirred her coffee slowly, her thoughts turning sharper. I don't want a screaming match, that won't change anything. But if I can show them, subtly, what I'm capable of, then maybe they'll think twice before dismissing me again. Together, they began outlining possibilities. Caroline scribbled notes on a napkin while Margaret spoke, her words steadier than before. They discussed exposing Richard's arrogance, not with confrontation but through facts, through examples that the community couldn't ignore. Caroline suggested reaching out to local business circles where Margaret's quiet reputation as a reliable, disciplined worker might contrast sharply with Richard's loud bravado. Margaret nodded, determination flickering in her eyes. I'll start journaling every insult, every moment they've tried to belittle me, not as complaints, but as reminders. If I can transform those moments into actions, I'll have a roadmap. That evening, back at her modest home, Margaret opened an old leather-bound journal. She began writing, not just the brunch incident, but the memory of Evelyn dismissing her college ambitions, of Richard laughing at her during a childhood piano recital, of Daniel brushing off her advice as if she were irrelevant. Each line of ink felt like reclaiming a piece of herself. She paused, staring at the pages. They think I'm just going to sit back, they don't know me anymore. For the first time in years, Margaret rehearsed conversations in front of her mirror. What she might say to Richard, how she could counter Evelyn's sharp remarks with calm facts, and how she could make Daniel realize that she was not a burden but a force. Her confidence wasn't roaring yet, but it was stirring step by step. And as she planned, a question lingered. Would her quiet strategy be enough to turn the tide, or would her family push her to fight louder than she intended? A week after that brunch, Margaret decided it was time to take her first step. Nothing bold or reckless, just enough to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of those who had always accepted Richard's words as gospel. She began with the neighborhood book club, hosted at Mrs. Donnelly's house every Thursday. Richard often boasted there about his supposed business acumen. That evening, as everyone sipped wine and discussed the latest novel, the conversation inevitably drifted toward Richard's real estate ventures. "Oh, Richard says he closed another big deal last month," Mrs. Donnelly remarked. "He certainly makes it sound like he's the backbone of Charleston's property market." Margaret smiled gently, her tone casual but steady. "Funny thing, did you know that deal nearly collapsed? The city records show it was actually a junior partner who saved it. Richard's version might be a little polished." The room grew quieter, eyebrows lifted. Whispers passed between a few women. Margaret didn't press further, she simply took another sip of her tea, letting the seed grow on its own. Later at church the following Sunday, she ran into Mr. Green, one of Richard's longtime acquaintances. He asked about her family, praising Richard for his sharp business mind. Margaret responded carefully. "Richard certainly has a talent for telling a story. Sometimes, though the numbers don't quite match the narrative, I've learned to check facts before I brag." She said it with a kind smile, not a hint of malice. Mr. Green tilted his head, surprised, as if he had never considered that side of Richard. Back at home, Margaret scribbled the events into her journal. Each small maneuver was like placing a chess piece in position, quiet, strategic, and effective. Her victories became more visible at a neighborhood dinner where Daniel and Jessica were also present. When Richard bragged about sponsoring a local charity event, one of the guests piped up, "Didn't Margaret help organize half of that event? I heard she was the one who kept the budget from collapsing." Richard's face tightened, his usual confident grin faltering for a moment. Margaret simply smiled, neither confirming nor denying, letting the moment speak for itself. Walking home that evening, she felt a quiet rush of satisfaction. It wasn't vengeance, it was justice delivered in whispers. And more importantly, people were beginning to look at her differently, with curiosity and even respect. Still, Margaret reminded herself, every step had to balance strategy with restraint. Too much too soon and she'd look vindictive. But with patience, she could reshape the story entirely. Would you in her place keep these victories subtle, or push harder for immediate recognition? A soft drizzle had just ended when Margaret sat on a worn bench in Marion Square, Charleston's lively downtown park. The smell of wet grass and blooming magnolias drifted through the air. She often came here to clear her head after church, but that afternoon, a message on her phone left her unsettled. It was from Clara Whitmore, her mother's estranged cousin who had lived in Atlanta for decades. Margaret barely remembered her, just whispers from childhood about the aunt who chose exile over family arguments. The message was short but piercing. "I hear you're finding your voice, Margaret. Don't let history repeat itself. Can we meet?" 2 days later, they sat together at a quiet corner cafe near King Street. Clara, now in her late 60s, carried herself with quiet dignity, her silver hair tied back, her eyes sharp with both sorrow and wisdom. "I left this family," Clara began softly, "because I was always the scapegoat. Your mother, she had a way of pushing me down so she could shine. And Richard reminds me so much of her younger self, charming but cruel when it mattered." Margaret's throat tightened. "So it isn't just me then. I thought maybe I was imagining it, exaggerating." Clara shook her head. "No, dear, I know the humiliation. The endless corrections, the dismissive laughter. I walked away. But walking away doesn't always mean peace." There was a silence between them, broken only by the clink of cups around the cafe. Margaret's eyes dropped to her coffee, emotions twisting inside her. Forgiveness tugged at her heart. Was her mother simply repeating patterns she had inherited? Yet resentment surged just as strongly. Why should she carry all the pain? "I don't want to disappear like you did," Margaret admitted, her voice trembling. "I want to stay, to change things, but sometimes I wonder if I'm just too weak." Clara reached across the table, taking her hand. "Weakness isn't in endurance, Margaret, it's in silence. And you're not silent anymore." In that moment, a flashback flickered in Margaret's mind, her younger self, 12 years old, watching Richard and her mother laugh at her mispronouncing a poem at dinner. The sting of shame, the heat of tears. That memory bled into the present, but this time she didn't shrink. She sat taller. As they parted, Clara whispered, "Use your pain wisely. Don't let bitterness define you. Let it fuel you." Walking back through the cobbled streets, Margaret felt raw but resolute. Forgiveness and resentment still wrestled inside her, but something new had taken root: clarity. The game ahead wasn't just about reputation, it was about reclaiming her dignity, her future. If you were Margaret, would you embrace forgiveness for peace? Or hold the fire of resentment to drive change? Over the following weeks, Margaret's plan grew sharper, more deliberate. She wasn't reacting impulsively anymore, every move was calculated. Her first step was to reconnect with contacts from her former career in Charleston's real estate sector. She met Jonathan Price, a 55-year-old developer she had worked with years ago, over coffee at a quiet office cafe. "Margaret," he said, raising his eyebrows in surprise, "it's been a long time. How's life treating you?" "Busy, Jonathan, and I've realized there are some stories that need correcting," she replied, carefully choosing her words. "Richard's deals, some of the narratives circulating are misleading. I thought you'd want the real numbers." Jonathan nodded slowly, intrigued. Margaret handed over neatly organized documents, each piece exposing discrepancies Richard had left unchecked. "It's subtle," she said. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone publicly. Just let the truth speak for itself." Meanwhile, she quietly cultivated her presence on local social networks. Her posts about community initiatives, charity work, and small victories began attracting attention. Neighbors who had once dismissed her were now reaching out to congratulate her, curious about her influence and accomplishments. Even family gatherings became strategic arenas. At a Sunday dinner at Daniel's house, Margaret carefully mentioned her involvement in a local charity auction. "I help secure the venue, organize sponsors, and keep the budget balanced," she said casually, letting the acknowledgement sink in. A few whispered exchanges among guests confirmed the subtle shift people were noticing. Her legal consultations were discreet. She met with a family law attorney, Ms. Harper, a sharp-minded 60-year-old, to understand the protections she could invoke regarding property disputes and inheritance matters. Margaret didn't intend to attack Richard immediately. She merely positioned herself with knowledge, creating leverage for when the right moment arrived. Through it all, her confidence soared. At home, she rehearsed conversations in front of the mirror, refining tone and timing. Each phone call, meeting, or social interaction became another move in her carefully orchestrated chess game. She discovered a new strength within herself: calm, precise, unshakable. By the end of the month, Margaret could feel the tension in the air. Richard's bragging had lost some of its punch. Subtle questions from acquaintances revealed cracks in his once imposing facade. Daniel, too, had begun to pause when talking about his mother's house, aware that Margaret was quietly reclaiming influence. Margaret smiled to herself that night. Every small maneuver, every whispered correction, every factual revelation brought her closer to the confrontation she had long envisioned. The stakes were rising, and she was ready. Would you, in Margaret's place, continue climbing strategically, or risk acting too soon and jeopardize everything? The annual Turner family reunion was held at the Charleston Community Hall, a sprawling space Margaret had seen every year of her life. This year, however, was different. Margaret entered quietly, dressed impeccably, exuding calm authority that drew a few curious glances from neighbors and extended family. Richard was there, of course, surrounded by admirers and casual friends. Daniel and Jessica hovered nearby, unaware that the woman they had long underestimated was about to shift the entire dynamic. Margaret's mother, Evelyn, watched from a corner, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly, sensing the change in her daughter's demeanor. When dinner concluded, Richard stood to boast about a recently successful investment, his usual confident smirk in place. Margaret took a slow breath and stepped forward. "Richard," she began, voice steady, commanding attention, "you've spoken so much about your successes, but I think it's time people heard a complete picture." She held up the neatly compiled documents she had prepared: property records, financial statements, and correspondence showing the discrepancies in his claims. Richard's smirk faltered. "Margaret, what is this?" "You know exactly what it is," she said calmly. "This is the truth you've tried to hide. And Daniel, the house you took from me without asking, it's more than bricks and walls, it's my life's work. I trusted you and you overstepped." A hush fell over the room. Neighbors and extended relatives exchanged shocked looks. Margaret's words weren't angry, they were precise, pointed, undeniable. Daniel stammered, "Mom, eyes." Margaret held up a hand. "No interruptions, let me finish." Her tone left no room for debate. "For years I stayed silent. I tolerated criticism, mockery, and dismissal, but not anymore. You've underestimated me, and now the balance has shifted." Even Evelyn's face softened slightly. Margaret continued, "I'm not here to humiliate anyone. I am here to claim the respect I've earned and remind you all that ignoring or belittling someone doesn't erase their worth." Neighbors whispered, some nodding. Friends who had observed her small victories over the past months looked on with pride. Richard's arrogance had dissolved into unease. Daniel's guilt was visible, while Jessica looked confused, realizing for the first time the depth of Margaret's resilience. Margaret placed the documents on the table and stepped back. "I hope from this day forward we treat each other with honesty and respect. That is all I ask." The room remained silent for a moment. Then applause quietly broke out, starting with a few neighbors, then spreading as family members acknowledged her dignity and the undeniable truth she presented. For Margaret, the payoff of months of careful planning, subtle exposure, and strategic maneuvering had finally arrived. She had turned humiliation into empowerment, quietly but decisively. The days after the reunion brought a calm but significant shift in the Turner household. Margaret noticed subtle changes in the way her family interacted with her. Gestures that had once been routine or dismissive now carried recognition, and in some cases, quiet admiration. One afternoon, Margaret's mother Evelyn approached her while watering the flowers in the backyard. "Margaret," she began, her voice softer than usual, I see now that I've been harsh, maybe unfair. I never realized how much you carried quietly all these years." Margaret met her mother's gaze. "Mom, I don't need apologies for everything, just acknowledgement. I've spent decades giving my best to this family. It's enough that you see me now." Evelyn nodded slowly, a small but meaningful smile breaking through. "You've always been strong. I should have realized it sooner." Richard, too, approached in his own awkward way. "Mom's right, Margaret, I misjudged you. I let my pride overshadow what you've done for all of us. I'm sorry." Margaret felt a weight lift, but she maintained her composed posture. "Apologies are accepted, Richard. What matters now is respect moving forward, not dwelling on the past." Even Daniel, who had once treated his mother's house as an entitlement, started to include her in decisions, consulting her opinion on community events and personal matters alike. Margaret recognized that these were small gestures, but gestures that reflected a genuine shift. Walking through the Charleston neighborhood, Margaret noticed neighbors greeting her with friendly recognition, discussing her role in local charity events, and occasionally asking for her advice on organizing community projects. At home, small moments of appreciation, her younger sister Linda expressing pride in her strategic approach, Caroline congratulating her discreetly, reinforced Margaret's growing confidence and sense of dignity. She realized that her plan hadn't been about revenge alone. It had been about reasserting herself, ensuring her voice mattered, and teaching her family a lesson in humility and respect without resorting to humiliation or anger. As the week ended, Margaret sat quietly on her porch sipping tea. The air felt lighter, the bonds with her family steadier, and the understanding mutual. A sense of emotional closure settled over her, the satisfaction of a strategy executed thoughtfully, and the quiet triumph of having reclaimed her rightful place within her family. A week after the family reunion, Margaret took a solitary walk along Rainbow Row, Charleston's iconic pastel-colored historic street. The soft hum of tourists, the distant call of seagulls, and the warmth of the morning sun provided a gentle backdrop for reflection. She thought back to the countless times she had been overlooked, Richard's mocking laughter at family dinners, Evelyn's constant criticisms, Daniel's casual entitlement over her home. Each memory, once sharp and painful, now felt like a lesson etched into her resilience. Margaret paused near the battery, watching the water shimmer in the early light. "I've learned patience," she mused silently. "Rushing in anger wouldn't have achieved anything. Strategy and subtlety built respect far stronger than confrontation ever could." Her phone buzzed, a message from Linda lighting up the screen. "Mom, I've never been prouder. You taught us all a lesson without raising your voice. Love you." Margaret smiled, fingers hovering over the reply. "Thank you, Linda. It means more than you know." Later, she met Caroline at a small cafe by King Street. Over lattes, they discussed the recent events. "Margaret," Caroline said, "you've grown so much. I've never seen you this confident, this empowered." Margaret laughed softly. "It wasn't easy, Caroline, but every humiliation, every quiet dismissal, they became tools, not burdens. I learned how to reclaim my life without losing my integrity." She reflected on her transformation. Where she had once shrunk in corners, she now walked through life asserting her presence. Her family recognized her value, her neighbors acknowledged her influence, and she finally felt the inner confidence that had been dormant for decades. As she strolled past the Charleston City Market, Margaret couldn't help but notice how differently she viewed the world. Each interaction was an opportunity to assert dignity, each decision a chance to maintain self-respect. The past still lingered in memory, but it no longer defined her. Internal dialogue flowed seamlessly with her surroundings. I am not invisible. I am capable. I am strong. Margaret knew the story wasn't truly over. Life would bring new challenges, and she would face them with the same blend of patience, strategy, and courage. But for now, she embraced the hard-earned peace and empowerment she had cultivated. Could you, after years of being overlooked, transform humiliation into strength without losing your compassion? As the sun began its descent over Charleston Harbor, painting the sky in hues of orange, pink, and gold, Margaret stood at the edge of the boardwalk, letting the gentle breeze brush against her face. She breathed deeply, feeling the weight of months of planning, strategy, and quiet determination finally lift from her shoulders. Her journey had been long and complex, moments of humiliation, subtle victories, strategic moves, and emotional revelations, but each step had shaped her into a woman who knew her own worth. She thought back to her mother who had begun acknowledging her value, to Richard who now understood the consequences of arrogance, and to Daniel who had started to see her as more than just the quiet one. Margaret turned toward the fading sunlight, her silhouette strong and confident. I didn't seek revenge for the sake of anger, she murmured to herself. I sought respect, dignity, and growth, and I found them not by shouting louder but by standing firm in my own truth. Nearby, the soft chatter of tourists and the distant call of a seagull provided a peaceful soundtrack. Margaret smiled, recalling Caroline's advice, Clara's encouragement, and even the moments of doubt she had faced alone. Each memory reinforced that her victory was as much internal as external. She glanced at her journal, tucked safely under her arm, filled with strategies, reflections, and lessons learned. It was a testament to her journey, a roadmap she could revisit whenever life demanded patience and careful planning. Then, as the sky deepened into twilight, Margaret posed a question, not just for herself, but for everyone who had followed her journey. Would you choose revenge, forgiveness, or self-growth? It was a question meant to linger, to spark reflection. Her story demonstrated that empowerment didn't require public humiliation, that patience and intelligence could reshape relationships, and that dignity could be reclaimed without losing compassion. Margaret took her first step along the boardwalk, each movement confident, deliberate, and free from the shadows of past grievances. Behind her lay the chapters of struggle, injustice, and subtle triumphs. Ahead lay the open horizon of her future, bright, uncharted, and full of possibility. As the screen would fade to black, viewers were left with the reflective choice. How would they respond when confronted with betrayal or disregard? Margaret's story was complete, but its lessons and its call to action lingered long after the final scene.